Hi, I'm Ethan Wong, and today I'm here talking with Elisa New. So, do you want to introduce yourself a little, talk a little bit about what you
Oh,
do?
sure. Of course. So I'm Elisa New, and I, for many years, have taught courses in poetry at the University of Pennsylvania and then at Harvard. And now I've just accepted a position as director of a Center for the Public Humanities at Arizona State University. And in all of these, I guess increasingly, I've thought about how to bring poetry, understanding of poetry, love of poetry to people who think they don't like it. And that's always been more challenging and enjoyable for me from the earliest days of my career than talking to people who do read poetry all the time. People, it's fun to talk to people who do read poetry, but helping those who find the art form intimidating or mystifying or annoying because obscure, that's even more fun for me. So that's who I am.
Yeah, that's great, and congratulations. But
Thank you.
something I want to just straight up start off with is actually a question I usually ask poets who write a lot of poetry. So I was interested in seeing your perspective about this, which is what do you feel is special in the way poetry is presented or the way poetry is written as opposed to prose or novels or some other form of fiction?
I think I've spent my whole life marveling at this, and my feelings about it change. I think what I find so remarkable is the way each really strong poet develops a linguistic lens all their own, a tool they made out of words that helps us see the world more in its potency. And um and it's important that this medium is created out of words in a way that prose and it we're always feeling with poetry um that words are being made to give us this special encounter with the world. And I think I've been thinking about that recently, especially I also have a television series, and I've been trying to teach the technique of enjambment, which is a choice that a poet makes to break a syntactical unit midway, and that has all sorts of effects. And I was explaining it to my husband, and I said, in a page of prose, it's just really not an option. The prose just goes on. Language, the conventions that govern the way this kind of writing proceeds make it impossible for us to make a little part of the machine out of a broken sentence in that way. And so for me, it's about understanding language as so flexible a medium, as though the tool could be invented. It's not a stable tool. It's being invented on the fly by every poet for every poem.
Yeah, I mean, that really puts kind of a finger on there's almost this ineffable quality about it, about how you try to understand why reading poetry feels a certain way when it feels as though the way the emotion develops is completely different when you read other pieces of work, or the way your understanding of the work develops is completely different, whether that's in pace or kind of just the depth of the understanding in general.
I think it's also, and this is especially with lyric poetry. I thought of this when you said pace. It's also that, um, especially with lyric poems that sit on a page, it's just one, there it is in front of you. it doesn't extend beyond you. You have the opportunity to kind of lower yourself into this other world that in a way that feels very, very, it's not really that it feels physical so much as that it feels um, like a covenant. It feels one feels the commitment of entering into this world like a door that you go through. And with prose, you're just kind of, you're moving, and with longer poems. So longer poems are a different, and I, I, I'm fascinated with poets like Whitman, where the poem exceeds you always and everywhere. It's always longer than you. It's always bigger than you. It's always earlier than you. It's always later than you. And and so it's a different kind of relationship that you have to it. But these ideas that we're discussing right now are like they continue to preoccupy me and kind of dawn on me. I think when I was much younger, I liked poetry. I was engaged in sort of mastering how it worked. I liked the identity of being a poet who cared about poetry, and I mean being a person who cared about poetry, and I did write poetry years ago as well. I discovered I did not like being a poet. It was an identity I didn't want. Um, so so it's wonderful to sort of spend one's life with an art form, wrestling and wrestling with in it in your in it with it in your mind.
Yeah. I mean, there are things about poetry which I'm sure it'll be very hard for me to ever understand if I even do at all. So that's kind of the fun of it in a way.
Hmm. Yeah, when I think about Emily Dickinson, for instance, I mean she's a poet who created so many poems that are so worthy of my attention that I find I've probably only really engaged with a few hundred of them, really. Maybe 300, maybe 400, but they're almost 1800. And I'm getting up there in years, and I don't know that it's going to happen, that I'm really going to really ever have the experience of all of Emily Dickinson's work. And that's kind of amazing. She died when she was younger than I am. Um, yeah, what an art form. You're
Yeah.
just the beginning. It's wonderful.
And so something I kind of want to touch on too, which is that in like the context that I kind of grew up analyzing poetry, it's always I found this to be funny because it's always been a very drab thing amongst like the school children when they go to English class to pick up a poem and then be like, okay, so they use metaphor here or they use alliteration in these two lines. So kind of what is your insight about why it's important to analyze poetry and maybe along with that how we can make it more interesting?
Well, I love the word you used, the drab. That is a drab. That's a good word for the approach that we've resorted to, which is identifying poetic devices. And in part that does come from testing, from the world of testing, since that's what we can extract. Um, and it isn't that knowing the names for things isn't useful. When you see a feature in a poem time after time, it's really good not to have to say, that thing where a word sounds like another word and it's at the end of a line. It's good. It's good to have language for that. Um, but I think that we didn't make the transition well from culturally in America, from that moment when everybody had to memorize poems. Everybody, if you talk to older people, oh yeah, I had to memorize long poems. Everyone had to memorize them and stand up and recite them. And they were standing up and reciting poems was a kind of entertainment you did for the community. And so now we are coming back to that some with spoken word, the performed, you know, the poetry as a performed art is back, and that may be in part why students like it more and are leading us back into an older way of reading poetry. But I create courses for teachers, and I have these four principles that we teach, and they are, and one of them is enjoy language, which does mean sort of notice the funny things one can do to language, like metaphors really are pretty powerful, and sonic effects, rhymes or jam, you know, enjoy that, which, but you can't really enjoy it until you notice it. And so the first principle that I try to stress when I teach teachers and teach students to read poetry is that it's really about crawling all over it, or and just making observations, often lots of them, you know, like letting yourself react and noticing what you notice. So if something sounds kind of interesting, if there's repetition, if there's vocabulary that's unfamiliar, if you know, it seems to be about a person, or it seems not to be about a person. All of these things, and in the absence of permission to kind of crawl all over it, or as Billy Collins in that famous poem, you know, that famous poem, he's, you know, he says we tie poetry to a chair and torture the meaning out of it. Um, instead of that, you know, he says he wants the poem to be like the guy on water skis who like skis past you and waves high. That's fine too. That you can let it act on you. You can kind of let yourself notice whatever you notice, including I have no idea what this means, or and and I might never. You can let yourself have all of those experiences, and you'll like it better. you'll, you know, the problem is that you can't then turn it into a test question. And a lot of a lot of the ways we study literature, not just poetry, came from literature becoming an academic field later than other fields. Um and because poetry and literature overall, I mean, it's these are art forms that were created out of joy, not necessarily because you needed to learn them in school. And so I think there's sort of a mismatch, but I mean, I'm giving a very long answer to this, but because I think it's so important that in school we teach poetry well, a lot of the work I do now is creating courses for high school teachers and students so that they can have more fun reading and learn more and have poetry mean more to them.
Yeah, that's great. And something funny about that, which is when you're talking about like the way we have taught poetry recently, or not necessarily recently, but the way we have taught like literature is for testing or academics because it's been so late in its development. I was thinking of a story which was going around a while back, which is the state of Texas, which is where I live, has a standardized test called the STAR test, and the English section of it has poems in it, and they got the people who wrote those poems to take the STAR test, and they got a bunch of questions wrong. Like they got questions wrong about their own poetry because the interpretation was completely different from what they were going for. So
Right, right. And people who write tests, oh my goodness, you know, when you think about how tests are trying to trick you out of just sort of seeing what you see, you know, poetry I think poetry teaches us to trust our instincts, and also that many things can be true at once. And that's maybe the maybe some explanation for why that the poets failed, flunked their own poems. Because it's rare that a good poem isn't, you know, built out of tensions between possible answers. And that doesn't go well with standardized testing.
Yeah.
Not that, I mean, I think standardized testing can be useful in some contexts, but I don't think it's a great way to help people understand a poem. I have we've created in the courses I've created for high school, we have quizzes, but we don't they're not reading comprehension quizzes about poems. Um, because yeah, you want to open that up.
Yeah. If you're ready, I think we can go into a poem now.
Sure. So I was thinking about a poem that I could read with you, and it's one that I'd love to read, "The Bean Eaters" by Gwendolyn Brooks. Um, it's one of those poems that takes us into an unfamiliar world. Um, it's it's formally um, um, it's quite self-consciously formal, um, although its subjects are um, not formal folk, as you'll hear in a minute. And I'm really fascinated by the formality of the poem, and the way Brooks herself uses things like rhyme um, in poems about very, very humble people. So this poem's called "The Bean Eaters." They eat beans mostly, this old yellow pair. Dinner is a casual affair, plain chipware on a plain and creaking wood, tin flatware. Two who are mostly good, two who have lived their day, but keep on putting their clothes and putting things away and remembering with twinklings and twinges as they lean over the beans in the rented back room that is full of beads and receipts and dolls and cloths, tobacco crumbs, vases, and fringes.
Yeah. I see what you mean about that.
Yeah, it's these three quatrains, and one of them starts to sprawl. Um, and it's a poem about two old people who don't have any money, um, who live in one room somewhere in Chicago, I presume, because Gwendolyn Brooks is often kind of showing us her Chicago neighborhood. And it's very much about their material lives, um, but also about being a couple who derive comfort from a set of material experiences that are shared. Um, and it's an incredibly excuse me. Sorry, my husband does not respect interviews. I've just given him a rebuke. You can edit this out or leave it in. It'll be more fun. Um, so I love this poem, and I like the way the form lends some dignity, a kind of stateliness, um, to this pair. I, I'm fascinated by the lines "two who are mostly good," and Brooks capitalizes "mostly good." Two, and then two who have lived their day but keep putting on their clothes and putting things away, where the mostly good, you know implies some sort of moral self-reckoning that they do. Okay, we're mostly good. Just what that means, we have no other insight into who they are, how they feel. But then two who have, and then what comes after that is two who have lived their day but keep on putting their clothes and putting things away, and so there's the obedience to routine, which may stand in for some other idea of goodness. Or I don't know, that middle stanza is so, it veils who they are. And then the end, the whole poem kind of breaks out into the litter of objects around them, some of which they've kept, and some of which they've are kind of part of the disarray, and you can't tell which is what. It's it's just a it's just an incredibly moving poem. I'd love to. You don't have it in front of you, so I'd like to hear what you think about it. But it's scary, I think, to hear a poem and then have to just jump right in.
Uh,
Yeah,
I
please.
oh sorry. I just hearing the poem. I think it's very much, uh, especially something I grabbed onto immediately was relatively obvious. It was the remembering part, and I think an important. I thought there was this implication that you're in this kind of, and for lack of a better word, dingy place now with your loved ones, and you're kind of scraping around for food. You're, I guess, eating beans,
Mhm.
but there's always this remembering of, and we don't even know if there was a better time,
We
but
have
we
no
would
idea.
assume it was some sort of better time that they're remembering or thinking back to. And there's kind of the implication of that too, maybe.
Yes, I think that's really important. And like two who are mostly good, remembering gives us some orientation in their inner lives or in how they think of themselves. But just to follow up on that point, and remembering with twinklings and twinges. So and twinklings and twinges, which are so oddly paired. Twinklings, what's twinkling? Your eye, the I mean, obviously the twinkling sounds a little more positive, and the twinges sounds like you've got a backache, or regrets. Um, but that's it. That's the that's all the inner life we get, and we're told, we know that it's there, and we can see these human beings, and we can be very touched by them, as human beings, without getting any third person, telescope into, or microscope in, or prying. We don't we are not told very much about them, and the fact that it's they eat beans mostly. I mean, that's so important. The fact that the poem begins with "they eat beans mostly" tells us that life is organized around what they eat. Um,
Mm.
and and it even though the poem says, it's not fancy the way they eat. Dinner's a casual affair, plain chipware on a plain and creaking wood, tin flatware. They dine. It's not fancy, but it's social. There's some preservation here of human beings eating together. They're not they're an organized couple. We somehow believe that they love each other, that there's these details. So what a remarkable poem made out of these rhymes and this sort of stiffness and stately tone and all these little weird objects is just a marvel. Um, so that's a poem I like.
That was great. And I think something that came out of this is that kind of hearing you talk about poetry, a certain poem, the way you analyze a poem, and the way you describe all these aspects of poetry, I kind of come to understand the enthusiasm you have for it. And I definitely think that enthusiasm is so crucial to actually getting other people interested into poetry. Because just hearing you be enthusiastic about poetry, it's not like I wasn't enthusiastic about poetry before, but you've got me feeling way more hyped up now. So that's
Thank
a
you.
really big part of it.
That's great. Well, I do. It's genuine. I mean, I do love it. It touches me. And I think I've developed over, I've developed my faculties of being touched by poetry. And it gives me so much pleasure that I think it's not that I self-consciously model that, but I just, it's just true that I really like it. I really, I really, really like it. And I marvel at, when I read poetry with people who almost never do. I started a big online class the other night and we read, and I read a few lines of a poem with the students. And all we had to do is slow down a little bit and they were just seeing so much and, starting to enjoy it. Um, so it's great. We're lucky there's poetry in the world.
Thank you. Yeah. Do you have any closing words you want to say before we kind of wrap up the interview?
I don't I don't think so. I think, are you editing this at all? Or are
Uh,
you,
for the most part, I wasn't planning to, but
well, you can decide to what to do with my husband interrupting our interview, even though he knew there was one. It's up to you. I don't think, no, I think we've had a great talk. The second great talk, as you and I worked on some Edna St. Vincent Millay together, and you were really great on it. I haven't quite finished up that episode yet. So, but you're very much in it, Ethan. Uh,
okay.
get ready.
I will get ready for that. I'm excited to see how it turns out.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.